The lawyer opened my grandfather's safe and pulled out an envelope with my childhood nickname. The solicitor's office smelled of old paper and furniture polish, and I remember thinking, as I sat there in a hard-backed chair between my mother and my Uncle Gerald, that it was a strange sort of room to end a life in, all beige carpet and dusty filing cabinets, nothing at all like the rambling, ivy-strangled farmhouse my grandfather had actually lived and died in. My name is Poppy Ashworth, and 3 weeks earlier my grandfather, Wilfred Ashworth, had been found dead in his armchair at Hollowbrook Farm, a mug of cold tea still sitting on the side table beside him, the crossword half finished on his lap, precisely the sort of death you'd wish on someone you loved, quiet and unremarkable and, according to the doctor, entirely painless. He was 81. He had, as far as any of us knew, been in reasonably good health for a man his age, though my mother said afterwards that he had seemed a little distracted the last time she'd visited, a little too eager to talk about the old days. The solicitor, a thin, precise man named Mr. Pemberton with half-moon glasses and the sort of careful, unhurried manner that made you want to shake him, had rung my mother 2 days after the funeral to say that Grandad's will named a specific witness requirement for the reading, that all 3 of his grandchildren, and both of his children, needed to be present in his office, in person, on a specific date, as per your father's very particular instructions. It struck all of us as odd at the time. Grandad had never been a particularly formal man. He wore the same cardigan for a decade and fixed his own guttering well into his 70s. The idea of him leaving behind particular instructions, delivered through a solicitor with half-moon glasses, felt almost like a joke he might have played on us, except that he was dead, and dead men don't play jokes, or so I believed then. We sat in a row, my mother, Helen, drawn and pale in her black cardigan, my Uncle Gerald, my mother's older brother, in an expensive suit that seemed slightly too smart for the occasion, tapping his foot with an impatience he wasn't bothering to hide, my cousin Victoria, Gerald's daughter, scrolling through something on her phone until her father shot her a look, and me, 24 years old, the only one of the 3 grandchildren who still lived within 20 miles of Hollowbrook Farm, the only one who had, if I'm honest, actually visited Grandad more than twice a year. Mr. Pemberton cleared his throat and opened a slim folder. Before I read the will itself, he said, I have been instructed to carry out a rather unusual request. Mr. Ashworth left, alongside his will, a small safe, which he asked to be brought to this office and opened in the presence of all of you, together, before any further business is conducted. Gerald's foot stopped tapping. A safe, he repeated. Dad never mentioned a safe. He was, I understand, a private man, Mr. Pemberton said mildly, and buzzed his secretary to wheel in a squat, gray metal box on a small trolley, the sort of thing you'd expect to find bolted into the floor of a bank vault rather than sitting in a solicitor's office in a market town in Gloucestershire. He worked the combination, a number, I would later learn, that was my grandmother's birthday, dead herself for 11 years, and the door swung open with a soft, mechanical click that seemed unreasonably loud in that quiet room. Inside, there was very little. A small bundle of old documents tied with string. A pocket watch that had belonged, I knew, to my great-grandfather. And, propped upright at the very front, a single cream envelope, sealed, with 4 words written across the front in my grandfather's unmistakable, slightly shaky hand. For my Sprout, only. I felt my mother grow very still beside me. Gerald turned to look at me with an expression I couldn't quite place, surprise, certainly, but something else beneath it too, something sharper. Sprout, Mr. Pemberton said, glancing down at a note clipped to the file, is, I believe, a childhood nickname. Mr. Ashworth was very specific that this envelope be opened by, and only by, the grandchild who answers to it. Nobody in that room but Grandad had called me Sprout since I was perhaps 6 years old, a name he'd given me because I was small for my age and, according to family legend, had once refused to eat anything except sprouts for an entire fortnight when I was a toddler, driving my mother nearly to distraction. It was a name so private, so specifically ours, that hearing it spoken aloud in that beige, dusty room felt like hearing a ghost say my name. "That's me," I said quietly, and Mr. Pemberton passed the envelope across the desk into my hands, and I felt, even before I opened it, that something enormous was about to happen, though I could not, at the time, have told you what. I did not open it there, in front of everyone, though I could feel Gerald's eyes on the envelope as though he might will it open through sheer force of irritation. Something in me, some instinct I couldn't fully explain, wanted to be alone when I read whatever my grandfather had left for me. "If you don't mind," I said, "I'd rather read it in private." Gerald made a small, dismissive noise. "For heaven's sake, Poppy, we're all family. What could Dad possibly have written that needs this much drama?" "She can read it however she likes," my mother said, with more steel in her voice than I'd heard from her in weeks, and something in Gerald's expression flickered, not quite anger, but a kind of calculation, as though he were recalculating some private sum. Mr. Pemberton, to his credit, simply nodded and showed me to a small side room, little more than a cupboard with a desk and a lamp, and left me alone with the door closed. My hands were shaking as I broke the seal. "My darling Sprout, if you are reading this, then I have died, and I am sorry for that, truly, though I confess I have had rather longer than most people to make my peace with the idea, and I find I am not so very frightened of it as I once was. I need you to do something for me, and I need you to do it exactly as I ask, without telling your Uncle Gerald or your cousin Victoria what you are about. I know that will feel strange, and perhaps unkind, and I promise you there is a good reason for it, which you will understand before the end. You remember the old treehouse in the orchard, the one your grandmother always said was a death trap and I always said was perfectly sound, and which, in the end, neither of us was entirely right about. Go there. Look inside the biscuit tin nailed to the back wall, the one we used to keep for Magpie's treasure when you were small. There is something inside it that will tell you where to go next. I have left you a trail, Sprout. A proper one, the sort we used to make for you when you were 7 and pretending to be a detective in your grandmother's old raincoat. I am asking you to follow it to the very end, because at the end of it, there is something I need you to find, and something I need you to understand about this family before I am gone from it entirely. Trust no one with this letter but yourself. Not even your mother, not yet. You will understand why, before long. All my love, always, my darling girl. Granddad. I read it 3 times before I fully absorbed it, sitting in that dim little side room with the lamp buzzing faintly overhead, and I remember the strangest sensation settling over me, not grief exactly, though grief was certainly there, tangled up in every line of his familiar, careful handwriting, but something closer to unease. My grandfather had never, in 81 years, been a man given to riddles and secrecy. He had been steady, plain-spoken, the sort of man who told you exactly what he thought of your choice of boyfriend or your choice of career whether you'd asked or not. This letter did not sound like him, and yet it was unmistakably, entirely his handwriting, his voice, his particular way of underlining a word for emphasis. Trust no one with this letter but yourself. Not even my mother. I folded the letter carefully back into its envelope, and I understood, sitting there, that whatever I was about to walk into, I was walking into it alone. When I returned to the main office, Mr. Pemberton was midway through reading the formal will, and I slipped back into my seat as quietly as I could, though Gerald's eyes tracked me the whole way, sharp and searching, clearly trying to read something in my expression that I was determined not to give him. The will itself, as Mr. Pemberton read it aloud, was almost disappointingly ordinary. Hollowbrook Farm and its surrounding 12 acres were to be held in trust, administered jointly by my mother and Gerald, until such time as the terms of a supplementary letter, held separately, are fulfilled. A modest sum to Victoria, for her studies. A modest sum to me, with love, and with faith that she will know what to do with it. The bulk of the estate's remaining value, investments, savings, a small portfolio of property Grandad had apparently accumulated quietly over the decades without any of us fully realizing, placed into the same trust, its final distribution to be determined according to the conditions set out in the aforementioned supplementary letter. What supplementary letter? Gerald said sharply, before Mr. Pemberton had even finished the sentence. This is absurd. Dad's estate should simply pass to his children in the ordinary way. What is all this business about conditions? I am not at liberty to disclose the contents of the supplementary letter, Mr. Pemberton said, entirely unbothered by Gerald's rising color, as your father's instructions were extremely specific on that point. I can tell you only that it exists, that it is held securely, and that its conditions are to be fulfilled, or not, within 6 months of today's date. Fulfilled by whom? Gerald demanded. Mr. Pemberton glanced, very briefly, in my direction, and then away again, so quickly I might have imagined it. That, he said, I am also not at liberty to disclose. I said nothing. I sat very still, the envelope with its 4 words, for my sprout, only, folded now inside my coat pocket, and I understood, with a cold, creeping certainty, that whatever trail my grandfather had left me in that orchard treehouse, it was not simply a sentimental scavenger hunt for an old woman's grandchild. It was, somehow, tied directly to the entire estate, to the farm, to the money, to whatever conditions Mr. Pemberton was so carefully not disclosing. Gerald left the office that afternoon in a barely restrained fury, muttering something to Victoria about seeing a solicitor of our own, first thing Monday, and I remember watching him go and feeling, for the first time in my life, something close to fear of my own uncle, a man I had known my whole life, who had bounced me on his knee as a baby, who now looked, in the low afternoon light through the solicitor's window, like a man calculating exactly how much money stood between himself and a locked orchard treehouse he did not yet know existed. I drove to Hollowbrook Farm alone the following morning, letting myself in through the side gate with the spare key Grandad had given me years before, when I was still small enough to need boosting over the fence. The farm looked exactly as it always had and entirely wrong at the same time, the sort of dissonance that grief produces, where a familiar place carries on existing in perfect, unbothered detail, the roses still climbing the same trellis, the same crooked weather vane creaking on the barn roof, while the person who gave that place its meaning is simply, permanently, absent from it. The orchard sat at the far end of the property, beyond the vegetable beds Grandad had kept meticulously weeded right up until the end, a small stand of apple and pear trees that had been old even when my mother was a girl. The treehouse was exactly where I remembered it, a lopsided wooden structure wedged into the crook of the largest apple tree, built by Grandad himself sometime in the 70s, according to family legend, and repaired by him roughly a dozen times since, each repair adding a fresh layer of mismatched, weathered timber. I climbed the rope ladder, my hands remembering the motion even though I hadn't done it in perhaps 15 years, and found, exactly where the letter had promised, an old biscuit tin nailed firmly to the back wall, its paint long since faded to a sort of dull, rust-spotted red. Inside, wrapped in a plastic bag to keep out the damp, there was a second envelope, and a small brass key I did not recognize. The note inside the envelope was shorter than the first. Well done, Sprout. You always were the only one who still remembered how to climb. The key belongs to the old writing bureau in my study, the one your grandmother inherited from her mother, the one Gerald has always said is worth a small fortune and has, on at least 2 occasions that I know of, tried to have valued without my permission. Go there next. But go carefully, and go soon. I fear you may not be entirely alone in looking. I sat in that treehouse for a long moment after reading it, the wind moving gently through the apple leaves around me, and I felt the unease from the day before sharpen into something closer to alarm. I fear you may not be entirely alone in looking. What did that mean? Was Granddad simply being dramatic, building suspense into his little scavenger hunt the way he always had when I was small? Or had he genuinely feared, in whatever state of mind had led him to write these letters in the first place, that someone else in this family might come looking for whatever he had hidden? I climbed down from the treehouse rather more quickly than I'd climbed up, and made my way back towards the farmhouse, the brass key clutched tight in my fist. The study was exactly as Granddad had left it, books stacked in uneven towers, a reading lamp still switched on from whenever he'd last sat there, an ashtray he hadn't used in years but had never quite got around to throwing away. The writing bureau sat in the corner beneath the window, a beautiful, dark wood piece with a fold-down desk and a dozen small drawers, the sort of furniture that looked as though it belonged in a museum rather than a working farmhouse study. The brass key fitted a small, unassuming drawer near the top, one I would never have thought to try on my own. Inside, there was a third envelope, and beneath it, folded flat, a photocopy of what appeared to be a bank statement, not Granddad's usual building society account, but something else entirely, an account I had never heard of, held in the name of a company I didn't recognize, Ashworth Land and Property Holdings Limited. The letter inside the envelope was longer this time, and my grandfather's handwriting, I noticed, had grown slightly less steady across its lines, as though it had been written across several sittings, on days when his hand did not entirely cooperate. Sprout, I am going to tell you something now that I have told no one else in this family, and I need you to read the whole of it before you do anything at all, however tempted you may be to ring your mother the moment you finish this page. Roughly 4 years ago, I discovered that your Uncle Gerald had, without my knowledge or permission, taken out a series of loans against the farm, my farm, this farm, using a power of attorney document he had persuaded me to sign some years before, back when I was recovering from my hip operation and not, I will admit, reading every document placed in front of me quite as carefully as I ought to have done. I do not believe, at the time, that I fully understood what I was signing. Your uncle has always been very good at making things sound reasonable when he wants something. By the time I discovered what had happened, Gerald had accumulated debts of a considerable size against the farm's value, debts he had used, as far as I have been able to determine, to fund a business venture of his own that subsequently failed. He had not told me. He had not told your mother. I found out entirely by accident, when a letter meant for him arrived at this house by mistake. I confronted him. He was, at first, apologetic, and promised he would find a way to repay the debts before I noticed any further trouble. I gave him the benefit of the doubt, Sprout, because he is my son, and because I did not want to believe that my own boy would put this farm at risk for his own gain. I was wrong to give him that benefit. Over the following 2 years, I discovered that he had continued borrowing against the estate, had begun making inquiries, quietly, with a property developer in Cirencester about the eventual sale of the land once it passed to him, and had, on at least one occasion, attempted to have me assessed by a doctor of his own choosing, to determine whether I was of sound enough mind to continue managing my own affairs. I want you to understand, Sprout, that I am not a foolish old man imagining conspiracies where none exist. I have the paperwork. I have kept it, carefully, for 4 years, waiting for the right moment, and the right person, to bring it to light. That person is you. I had to stop reading for a moment, the study swimming slightly around me. Gerald, my uncle, who had bounced me on his knee, who had walked me down the aisle of my own imagination at 100 childhood weddings I'd play-acted in this very garden, had been quietly defrauding his own father, mortgaging the family farm to fund a failed business, and had tried, at least once, to have Granddad declared incompetent. I read on. The bank statement I have left with this letter shows the account into which Gerald has been funneling the loan proceeds. I want you to take it to Mr. Pemberton, along with the rest of the documentation, which you will find at the very end of this trail. But I need you to understand something else first, Sprout, and this is the hardest part of what I have to tell you, so I am going to ask you to sit down, if you are not sitting already. I was already sitting. I gripped the edge of the desk regardless. I am not dead. I read that line perhaps 6 times before it fully landed, the way you read a sentence in a foreign language you only half remember, certain there must be some other meaning you're simply failing to grasp. I am not dead. Sprout, I need you to stay calm, and I need you to keep reading, because there is a very good reason for what I am about to explain, and I promise you it is not the act of a man losing his mind, however much it might sound like one. Roughly 6 weeks before you are reading this, I learned that Gerald had finally found a doctor willing to support a formal assessment of my mental competency, a Dr. Alan Fairweather, a man I have since discovered Gerald has been paying, quietly, for over a year, to build a case that I am no longer fit to manage my own affairs. Had that assessment succeeded, Gerald would have gained full legal control over this farm, and everything on it, within a matter of months, and I have no doubt whatsoever that he would have sold the whole estate to the developers in Cirencester before your grandmother's rose bushes had even finished flowering for the season. I could have fought this in the ordinary way, solicitors, doctors' reports, a great deal of expensive unpleasantness that would have torn this family apart in public, in exactly the sort of way your grandmother always dreaded. Instead, with the help of an old friend from my army days, a retired doctor named Frank Whitmore, and with Mr. Pemberton's full knowledge and cooperation, I arranged something rather more drastic. I am, as I write this, quite alive, and staying, quietly, in a small cottage some 40 minutes from the farm, under Frank's care, while Mr. Pemberton manages the appearance of my death in exactly the manner the law requires, with a death certificate signed by Frank himself, a closed casket at the funeral out of respect for my supposed condition, and a story about a peaceful passing in my armchair that I am rather proud of having invented, if I am honest. I do not enjoy deceiving my own family, Sprout, and I want you to know that this has cost me a great deal of sleepless nights. But I needed, more than anything, to see clearly who in this family would come looking for the truth out of love, and who would simply come looking for the money. I chose you for this trail because you are the only one of my grandchildren who ever climbed that treehouse without being asked to, who ever sat with me on a Sunday afternoon simply to talk, without wanting anything from me at the end of it. I needed to know, before I decided how to handle what Gerald has done, whether there was still someone in this family I could trust completely. There is one more stop on this trail, Sprout, and it will take you to me. Granddad, I do not know how long I sat in that study after finishing the letter, the bank statement trembling slightly in my other hand, the whole shape of the last 3 weeks, the funeral, the grief, the strange formality of the solicitor's office, rearranging itself around this one extraordinary fact. My grandfather was alive. He had faked his own death, with a solicitor's help and a retired army doctor's cooperation, to protect his farm from his own son, and to find out, once and for all, which of his grandchildren actually loved him rather than simply expecting to inherit from him. I thought, with a lurch of something between horror and grim amusement, of my mother, weeping at that funeral, weeping over an empty casket, believing with her whole heart that she had lost her father. I thought of myself, standing at that graveside in the rain, genuinely, completely grieving a man who was, at that very moment, 40 minutes away, drinking tea in some retired doctor's spare room. I felt, in that moment, a confusing wash of emotions I still find difficult to fully untangle: relief, disbelief, a flare of genuine anger at having been put through weeks of real, unnecessary grief, and beneath all of it, a fierce, unexpected gladness that made my eyes sting all over again, for entirely different reasons than before. Tucked into the very back of the envelope, beneath the letter, there was a final slip of paper, an address in a village I half recognized, perhaps 35 minutes' drive from the farm, and beneath it, in Granddad's handwriting, a single line. "Come alone, Sprout. And bring the documents from the bureau's second drawer. You'll find them beneath the false bottom, third panel from the left. Frank will explain the rest when you arrive." I searched the bureau properly then, running my fingers along the base of the second drawer until I found the seam Granddad had described, a thin wooden panel that lifted away to reveal a slim folder crammed with documents, copies of the loan agreements Gerald had taken out against the farm, letters between Gerald and the property developer in Cirencester, and, most damning of all, a signed letter from Dr. Alan Fairweather to Gerald, discussing next steps in the competency assessment. Discussing fees, discussing timelines, written in the sort of clinical, business-like language that made my skin crawl. I drove to the address with the folder on the passenger seat beside me, my hands tight on the wheel, my mind circling through the events of the past 3 weeks in an endless, dizzying loop. I thought about ringing my mother from the car, more than once, my thumb actually hovering over her name in my contacts, but each time I stopped myself, remembering the letter's insistence, "Trust no one with this until you understand the whole of it," and telling myself that whatever came next, I owed it to Granddad to see this through exactly as he'd asked. However strange and difficult it felt to keep a secret this enormous from my own mother. The cottage, when I found it, was small and unremarkable, tucked at the end of a quiet lane behind a row of overgrown hedges, the sort of place you could drive past 100 times without noticing. I parked outside, sat for a moment gathering myself, and then walked up the short garden path and knocked. The door opened, and there, standing in a cardigan I did not recognize, thinner than I remembered, leaning slightly on a walking stick he had never needed before, was my grandfather. Alive. I do not remember, precisely, the sequence of what happened next, whether I cried first or he did, whether I stepped forward or he did, whether either of us said anything coherent for the first several minutes. I remember only the astonishing, overwhelming fact of him, solid and real and warm when I finally threw my arms around him, the smell of the same pipe tobacco he'd never actually smoked but kept in a tin on principle, the particular scratch of his cardigan against my cheek. "There you are," he said, into my hair, his voice thick. "There's my Sprout." We sat in his small borrowed sitting room for a long time, a retired doctor named Frank Whitmore fussing quietly in the kitchen making tea neither of us drank, while Grandad explained, in far more detail than the letters had allowed, exactly what had happened over the past 4 years, Gerald's mounting debts, the forged power of attorney, the quiet campaign to have him declared incompetent, and finally, the desperate, drastic plan he and Frank and Mr. Pemberton had cooked up between them over several long evenings at this very kitchen table, to fake his death and buy himself the time and the leverage he needed to protect the farm properly, once and for all. "I am not proud of it," he said, holding my hand tightly across the small sofa. "Deceiving your mother, most of all. She has grieved a real grief these 3 weeks. And I cannot give that back to her, however glad she'll be to have me returned. That is a cost I will carry for the rest of my life, whatever life I have left. But I want you to understand, Sprout, I did not do this lightly. I consulted with Frank for months before I agreed to it. I very nearly called the whole thing off a dozen times. In the end, it came down to a simple choice: a few weeks of grief I could not undo, against the very real possibility of losing this farm, and everything in it, to a stranger's bulldozer, because my own son had decided my mind and my money were more valuable to him broken than whole. Why didn't you just fight him properly? I asked. Solicitors, doctors, the ordinary way. Why all this? Granddad was quiet for a long moment, looking down at our joined hands. Because I needed to know, he said finally, who in this family actually loved me, and who simply loved what I might leave behind. I am an old man, Sprout, and old men in my position are vulnerable in a particular way, surrounded by people who say they love you, never quite certain which of them mean it and which of them are simply waiting. I could have fought Gerald in the courts and won, perhaps, eventually, at the cost of years and a great deal of money and a family torn to shreds in public. Or I could disappear, quietly, and watch who came looking, and why. You came looking because you loved me, Sprout. You climbed that treehouse the very next morning, alone, without telling a soul, because some part of you trusted that whatever I'd asked of you, it was worth trusting. Gerald, I suspect, is at this very moment ringing solicitors of his own, trying to work out how quickly he can force a sale of the trust before the 6 months are up. That tells me everything I needed to know about the both of you. Frank Whitmore, it turned out, had served alongside my grandfather decades earlier, in a regiment neither of them spoke of much, and had remained close ever since, close enough that when Granddad had rung him, 6 weeks ago, with an extraordinary and faintly illegal proposition, Frank had agreed within a single conversation. It's not entirely without precedent, Frank told me. Over tea I finally accepted, though I won't pretend it's common, or that either of us has slept particularly well since we started down this road. I signed the death certificate myself, which is, I should say, an offense I could in theory be struck off for, if it ever came to light in the wrong way. I did it because I have known your grandfather 50 years, and because I have seen, at close hand, exactly the sort of family predation that happens to elderly people with money and property and children who've decided that money and property are owed to them rather than earned or given freely. What Gerald has been attempting to do to Wilfred is not so very different, in essence, from the sort of thing I saw far too often in my years of practice, families who love an inheritance rather more than the person attached to it. Is any of this legal? I asked. The death certificate. The fake funeral. Won't Granddad have to come back to life, officially, at some point? It is a great deal messier, legally, than either of us would like, Frank admitted, and yes, there will be a reckoning of sorts, a formal process to reverse the certificate, some rather awkward conversations with the coroner's office. Your grandfather has always known this was a temporary measure, not a permanent solution. The point was never to disappear forever, Poppy. The point was to buy enough time and gather enough evidence to bring what Gerald has done properly to light, in a way that protects the farm and protects your grandfather, before revealing himself and facing whatever consequences follow, which I suspect, given the strength of the evidence you're now holding, will fall rather more heavily on Gerald than on Wilfred. Granddad nodded slowly. Mr. Pemberton has been managing the legal side of things throughout, Sprout, more carefully than either Frank or I could have managed alone. The 6-month condition in the will was never truly about you finding buried treasure. It was about giving you, or whichever grandchild proved worthy of the trail, time enough to gather this evidence and bring it to him, so that he could act on it properly, through the correct legal channels, the moment I chose to reveal myself again. That moment, I think, has now arrived. How did you even persuade Mr. Pemberton to go along with any of this? I asked. He's a solicitor. Surely there are rules about this sort of thing. Whole chapters of some professional code he'd be breaking. There are, Granddad admitted, with the ghost of a smile. A great many of them, I imagine, though I confess I didn't ask too closely, for his sake as much as mine. Pemberton's father handled my affairs before him, and his father before that. 3 generations of Pembertons have kept this family's business in order, going back to before your grandmother and I were even married. I went to him, quietly, the week I first suspected what Gerald was doing, and I told him everything, and I asked him a single question. Not whether he'd help me fake anything, I hadn't even conceived of that plan at the time, but simply whether he believed me. Whether the paperwork I'd found was as damning as it looked, or whether I was simply an old man seeing conspiracies in ordinary family carelessness. And he believed you. He believed me within the hour, once he'd seen the loan documents. He'd apparently had his own quiet reservations about Gerald for some time, though it wasn't his place to voice them unprompted. It was Pemberton, in the end, who first raised the idea of the trail, not the faked death. That part came later, and came from Frank, and very nearly didn't happen at all. But the idea that I might test my family properly, before deciding how much of myself, and my estate, to hand over to any of them, that was entirely his suggestion. He's a more imaginative man than his glasses would suggest. I went to see Mr. Pemberton myself, a few weeks after everything had come out into the open, mostly to thank him properly, though I think, in truth, I also went because I wanted to understand how a man so precise, so careful, so apparently bound by rules, had agreed to help stage something so enormous and so risky. He received me in the same beige office where this whole extraordinary chapter had begun, and for the first time since I'd known him, he seemed genuinely uncertain how to begin. "I want you to know," he said eventually, "that I did not agree to any of this lightly, Miss Ashworth. I have practiced law in this town for 26 years, and I have never, not once before this, done anything remotely resembling what your grandfather asked of me. I lay awake most nights of those 6 weeks wondering whether I had made a catastrophic error of judgment, whether I had allowed my personal fondness for your grandfather to override my professional obligations in a way I would come to bitterly regret." "Why did you do it, then?" He removed his glasses, cleaning them slowly on the corner of his jacket, a habit I would come to recognize, over the following months, as the thing he did whenever a question required him to say something more honest than he was entirely comfortable saying. "Because I have watched a great many elderly clients, over the years, quietly stripped of their dignity and their assets by relatives who had convinced themselves, often quite sincerely, that they deserved what they were taking. I have drawn up the paperwork for it more times than I care to remember, always a step behind, always arriving only after the damage was already substantially done. Your grandfather gave me, for once, the chance to be a step ahead of it instead. I will not pretend that isn't part of why I agreed. It was not only loyalty to Wilfred. It was also, I think, a kind of professional restitution, for all the times I could not act quickly enough to help someone else. I rang my mother that evening, sitting in Frank's small garden as the light faded, my grandfather sitting quietly beside me, close enough to hear every word, gripping my free hand so tightly it nearly hurt. "Mum," I said, when she answered, "I need you to sit down before I say anything else." "Poppy, you're frightening me." "What's happened?" "Nothing's happened." "Nothing bad, I mean." "Mum, Granddad's alive." The silence on the other end of the line lasted so long I genuinely thought the call had dropped. When my mother finally spoke, her voice was very small, very careful, the voice of someone testing whether a sentence they'd just heard might, in fact, be some sort of cruel joke. "That isn't funny, Poppy." "I'm not joking, Mum. I'm sitting next to him right now. I don't have the words to explain it properly over the phone, but he faked his death, Mum, with Mr. Pemberton's help and a doctor friend of his, because he found out Gerald's been stealing from him for years." taking out loans against the farm, trying to have him declared incompetent so he could sell the whole place to developers. I heard my mother make a sound I had never heard her make before, something between a sob and a laugh, disbelief and grief and fury all tangled together at once. Gerald did what? We talked for nearly an hour, my grandfather occasionally leaning in to add a detail I'd got slightly wrong, Frank hovering nearby with more tea nobody drank, and by the end of it my mother was crying openly, the enormous relief of learning her father was alive colliding, messily, with the fresh horror of learning what her own brother had done, and had very nearly got away with. "I want to see him," she said finally. "Tonight, if I can. Poppy, I need to see him with my own eyes." She arrived at Frank's cottage just under an hour later, having apparently broken every speed limit on the way, and the sight of my mother and my grandfather embracing in that small, unremarkable sitting room, both of them crying, both of them laughing at the same time, my mother repeatedly saying "you absolute menace, you complete and utter menace" into his shoulder even as she held him tighter than I'd ever seen her hold anyone, is a memory I will carry, I think, for the rest of my life. We agreed, the three of us, along with Mr. Pemberton the following morning, that the confrontation with Gerald needed to happen properly, through the correct legal channels, with the evidence laid out clearly, rather than as some dramatic family showdown that might allow him to talk his way around the truth the way, I gathered, he had always been rather skilled at doing. Mr. Pemberton arranged a meeting in his office 4 days later, ostensibly to clarify certain conditions of the supplementary letter, and Gerald arrived looking pleased with himself in a way that, in hindsight, made my skin crawl, a man who believed, quite reasonably given what he knew, that he was about to hear good news about an estate he had already, I suspected, begun quietly planning how to sell. He did not know Grandad was waiting in the small side room until Mr. Pemberton opened the connecting door partway through the meeting and my grandfather walked out, entirely alive, entirely composed, and looked his son directly in the eye. I have never, in my whole life, seen a person's face do what Gerald's face did in that moment, the color draining from it so completely and so quickly that for one genuinely alarming second I thought he might actually faint. He half rose from his chair, sat back down, rose again, his mouth working uselessly for several seconds before any sound came out of it at all. "Dad," he finally managed. How are you? We buried you." "You buried an empty casket," Grandad said, quite calmly, settling into the chair beside Mr. Pemberton's desk as though he did this sort of thing every week. "I have been quite comfortably alive this entire time, staying with an old friend, while Mr. Pemberton and I gathered rather a lot of interesting paperwork about a series of loans you took out against my farm, and about a doctor you'd been paying to help you have me declared unfit to manage my own affairs. I believe you know the documents I mean, Gerald. Your friend Dr. Fairweather has been considerably less discreet in his written correspondence than you might have hoped." I watched something in Gerald collapse then, some final structure of denial finally giving way beneath the weight of what he clearly now understood was overwhelming, documented proof. He did not, to his very limited credit, try to argue for very long. He tried, briefly, to characterize the loans as temporary arrangements and the doctor's assessment as a reasonable precaution, given Dad's age, but the words came out thin and unconvincing even to his own ears, I think, and eventually he simply put his head in his hands and said nothing at all. "I'm not going to have you arrested, Gerald," Grandad said, after a long silence, and I heard, beneath the steel in his voice, something that sounded almost like grief. "You're my son, and whatever else you've done, I can't quite bring myself to do that to your mother's memory, or to Victoria. But you will repay every penny of what you've borrowed against this farm, on a schedule Mr. Pemberton will draw up, and you will have no further role in the management of my estate, now or after I'm properly, actually gone. That is not a negotiation. That is simply what is going to happen. The one person I had genuinely worried about, through all of this, was my cousin Victoria, 19 years old, quiet, and, as far as I could tell, entirely unaware of what her father had been doing until the moment the truth came out. I found her outside Mr. Pemberton's office afterwards, sitting on a low wall in the car park, staring at nothing in particular, and I sat down beside her without quite knowing what I meant to say. "Did you know?" I asked eventually. "About any of it?" She shook her head, and I believed her. There was a rawness to her expression that struck me as entirely genuine, the look of someone whose whole understanding of her own father had just been rewritten in the space of a single afternoon. "I knew he was under some sort of financial pressure," she said quietly. "He's been odd for a couple of years, tense about money in a way he never used to be. I never imagined, Grandad. He would have let them lock Grandad away, Poppy. Or as good as. For money." "You're not him," I said, because it seemed important, in that moment, to say it plainly. "Whatever he's done. Grandad knows that too. That's why you're still getting your inheritance exactly as the will says, regardless of what happens with your dad." Victoria was quiet for a while, and then, unexpectedly, she began to cry, not dramatically, just a slow, steady leaking of tears she didn't bother to wipe away. "I always thought you were his favorite," she said, "you know. Growing up. Because you actually liked coming to the farm, and I always found it boring, all that mud and those chickens, and I used to feel rather resentful about it, if I'm honest. I think I understand now why he liked having you around rather more than me. He never once made me feel like his favorite," I told her, and meant it. "He just noticed who turned up because they wanted to be there, and who turned up because they thought they had to. I think that's rather different from having a favorite. I think, if you'd wanted to spend more afternoons in the mud with the chickens, he'd have been just as delighted by that as he was by me." She managed a small, watery laugh at that, and I felt something ease slightly between us, not resolved, not entirely, but begun, in a way that felt, for the first time in years, genuinely honest. It took a further 6 weeks to sort out the formal, legal mess of undeclaring my grandfather's death, a process Frank had rather grimly predicted would be complicated, and which turned out to be exactly as complicated as promised, involving the coroner's office, a rather bewildered local registrar, and a great deal of paperwork that Mr. Pemberton handled with the same unhurried, half-moon glasses calm he'd brought to everything else. When it was finally, officially confirmed, on paper, in the eyes of the law, that Wilfred Ashworth was, in fact, alive, my mother insisted on holding a small gathering at the farm, not a party exactly, she said, but something. "We need to mark it somehow, after everything." Word had, inevitably, spread through the village by then, and half of it turned out that Sunday afternoon in the orchard, standing among the very apple trees where this whole extraordinary trail had begun, drinking tea and eating far too much cake, toasting a man who had, by any reasonable measure, come back from the dead. Grandad stood beneath the treehouse for most of the afternoon, a little more tired than he used to be, leaning rather more heavily on his stick than he had before all this began, but unmistakably, wonderfully himself, receiving a stream of neighbors who wanted to shake his hand or embrace him or simply stand near him for a moment, as though checking, with their own eyes, that the impossible thing they'd heard was really true. "I owe you an apology too, Sprout," he said quietly, finding me alone by the vegetable beds later that afternoon, the noise of the gathering drifting faintly behind us. "Weeks of real grief, for no genuine loss. I've turned that thought over more times than I can count these past 6 weeks, wondering whether I made the right choice, or simply the choice that suited me best." "You made the choice that saved the farm," I told him, "and protected yourself from a man who was trying to have you locked away for his own benefit." I was frightened, and I grieved you properly, and I'm angry about that part of it, a little, if I'm honest. But I understand why you did it. And I'd rather have 6 weeks of real grief and get to keep you at the end of it, than never have had the trail at all. He put his arm around my shoulders then, the way he used to when I was small enough for it to feel enormous, and we stood together for a while, looking out over the orchard, the treehouse leaning slightly in the late afternoon light, exactly as it always had. It was nearly a year later, at a small family dinner nobody had bothered to make particularly formal, that Grandad finally told me the last piece of the story, the part of the will's supplementary letter that even I, having followed the whole trail to its end, had never actually seen. The conditions Mr. Pemberton was so careful never to disclose, he said, over a glass of wine he was, by then, permitted rather more freely by his doctor, were simply this: that whichever grandchild followed the trail to its true end, with honesty and without telling a soul what they were doing along the way, purely because they trusted an old man's word, that grandchild would inherit Hollow Brook Farm outright, upon my actual death, whenever that eventually and genuinely comes. Not the money. Not the investments, which will still be divided fairly between all three of you, in the ordinary way, when the time comes. Just the farm itself. The orchard. The treehouse. All of it. I stared at him, my wine glass halfway to my lips, entirely forgotten. Grandad, I don't know what to say. Don't say anything yet, he said, with a small, familiar smile. You've a good many years still to wait before it's actually yours, God willing, and I intend to make the most of every single one of them, treehouse repairs and all. I simply wanted you to know, properly, what you were walking towards that first morning in the orchard, when you climbed up to that biscuit tin without a single question about what you might find. You didn't do it for the farm, Sprout. I want that understood, between the two of us, for as long as I've got left to say it. You did it because a note in an envelope had your name on it, and because you loved the man who wrote it. Everything else was simply what followed. I think of that afternoon often, now, the beige solicitor's office, the gray metal safe, the 4 words written in careful, shaky handwriting across a cream envelope, for my Sprout, only. I think about how close I came, in that first strange, disorienting hour, to simply handing the letter over, unopened, the way Gerald had so plainly expected me to. I think about how differently everything might have unfolded if I had, whether Gerald might have succeeded, in the end, in having Grandad declared unfit, in selling the farm to strangers who would have flattened the orchard for a housing estate before the ink on the paperwork was even dry, in erasing an entire family's history to fund a business that had already, quietly, failed. I think about Victoria, who might never have learned the truth about her own father at all, who might have spent the rest of her life believing him simply careful with money, rather than cruel with it. But I climbed the treehouse instead. I found the biscuit tin, and the bureau, and the address at the end of a quiet country lane, and at the very end of it all, I found my grandfather, alive, waiting, exactly where love had always been leading me, whether I fully understood the trail or not. These days, I visit the farm most weekends, and Grandad has taken, rather cheekily, to introducing me to new acquaintances in the village as my Sprout, who brought me back from the dead, a joke that never fails to earn him a startled, delighted laugh, and never fails to make my mother roll her eyes fondly from wherever she's standing. The treehouse has had another repair since, my own doing, this time, with Grandad supervising from a folding chair below and shouting up unhelpful instructions about nails he stopped using himself decades ago. The biscuit tin is still nailed to the back wall, empty now, though neither of us has ever quite been able to bring ourselves to take it down. 6 words started it, in the end, though it took me a long while to notice them properly, tucked into the very first line of the very first letter, the words that mattered more than any of the mystery that followed. My darling sprout, trust the trail. I did. And it led me, in the end, exactly where I most needed to go. People sometimes ask me, when they hear the full, strange shape of the story, and it has become, inevitably, something of a local legend by now, retold with fresh embellishments every time it does the rounds of the village pub, whether I ever resented Grandad for putting me through it. The weeks of real grief. The secrecy. The sheer, theatrical scale of what he'd arranged, simply to learn something he might, perhaps, have learned by asking us all outright. I don't think he could have learned it that way, though. I've turned the question over a great many times since, and I keep arriving at the same answer. Ask a person outright whether they love you more than your money, and nearly everyone, honest or not, will say yes. It's watching what they do when they believe no one is measuring them at all that tells you anything true. Grandad didn't need 6 words on a letter to know I loved him. He needed to watch me climb a treehouse alone, on the strength of nothing but a nickname and an old man's handwriting, before he could be entirely certain of it. I think, in the end, that's the only kind of proof that ever really counts, not what we say when we know we're being watched, but what we do when we think we aren't.